Beyond the Gates spoilers for Friday, September 26, 2025 tease that at Orphe Jean, Leslie finds herself caught up in an emotional storm she didn't expect. She came to this quiet diner just for a late meal, a chance to relax after the day's burdens. Instead, she stumbles into a conversation that shakes her certainty about the people she thought she understood. From her booth tucked away in the corner, the darkness becomes her shield as she hears voices drifting through the narrow aisles. June's voice is soft but sure, laced with the casual warmth of someone who has long since accepted loneliness as a companion. Ted's tone is even quieter, almost confessional, and it's the detail that makes Leslie's heartbeat quicken. Ted had always carried himself with a kind of subdued authority, the sort of man who believed he had a complete grasp on the little world he moved through. He prided himself on knowing the names and faces of every worker in town, especially in the diner where he spent so many restless evenings. Yet the moment June appeared with a tray balanced carefully in her hands, Ted's composure cracked. The way his brow furrowed and his lips parted told Leslie he had been caught off guard. June, working here? That was news to him. The exchange began innocuously enough. Ted made a half-joking promise that he'd start coming around more often now that he knew June was there. But beneath his words was a deeper undercurrent, an admission that he hadn't expected to feel compelled to linger in this place. Leslie, listening with mounting unease, sensed something familiar in his voice, an energy he hadn't shown in their conversations for months. Then came the subtle shift, the moment Leslie's world tilted. June's eyes, sharp and observant, caught the glint of the ring on Ted's finger. She didn't hesitate to bring it up, the question lingering in the air like smoke. Was he married? Ted didn't flinch. He admitted it plainly, even with a small nod as though stating a fact that needed no explanation. Yes, he was married. June's lips pressed together as if she weighed her own answer carefully. She confessed her solitude, how the years had folded her into silence, and how only recently the laughter of her children had returned to her days. Ted's response was unexpectedly gentle. He told her to hold on to her children as tightly as she could whenever life gave her the chance. He spoke with conviction, the words tumbling from a place of experience and regret. Leslie's stomach tightened. There was something too intimate, too raw in his tone. He had never spoken to her that way, never with such openness, as if each word carried a secret history. From her corner, Leslie strained to hear, but the distance betrayed her. The murmur of the diner blended with their words, turning sentences into fragments. Still, she pieced enough together to ignite suspicion. They had spoken of rings, of children, of promises that felt layered with meaning. And then it happened. She saw June hand Ted a small collection of rings, their dull metal catching the light under the fluorescent bulbs. Ted turned them over in his palm, his expression thoughtful, even heavy. He speculated aloud in ways that stung Leslie like hidden daggers. Maybe someone had abandoned them, left them behind deliberately. Maybe they had grown so exhausted with the weight of their marriage that they couldn't bear to see the ring on their hand for even one more day. His voice, low and contemplative, made Leslie's heart pound. It was impossible not to hear the undertone, the way his reflection on failed love sounded less like speculation and more like confession. June tilted her head, reading between the lines, realizing that Ted was no longer talking about strangers. He was talking about himself, about his own marriage. The silence that followed stretched thin, a wire ready to snap. Then Ted shifted, his tone lighter, dismissing the rings as relics of youth. He said marriage bands belong to the young, to people untouched by time's bitterness. With a quiet finality, he pressed the rings back into June's hand, wished her good night, and left her in the flickering light of the diner. The fury curled in her chest, venomous and undeniable. How dare he speak to June with a tenderness he never showed her? How dare he invest his words with a vulnerability he kept locked away at home? In Leslie's mind, the threads began to weave into a story she could not untangle. Perhaps Ted and June's bond stretched back further than she knew. Perhaps those children June spoke of weren't hers alone. Could it be possible that Ted was their father, that their shared past was surfacing under the guise of coincidence? The thought clawed at her, making her vision blur with anger and jealousy. Meanwhile, June sat with the ring still resting in her palm. Something about them stirred her. Their weight was more than metal, it was memory. She studied the engravings etched faintly into the bands, her breath catching as recognition sparked. The names carved into the surface unlocked a realization that sent her hands trembling. She didn't hesitate. She reached for her phone, dialing with urgency, the ring echoing in her ear until it connected. Far away, Naomi and Jacob were unraveling inside the grand but decaying halls of Hawthorne Estate. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and permanence, had become a labyrinth of dust and frustration. For hours they had torn through rooms, opening drawers, upturning boxes, searching for what seemed impossible to find. Naomi's voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion and fear. The ring mattered, she insisted. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a tether, a symbol she couldn't let slip through her fingers. Jacob, wearied by the endless hunt, snapped back. He argued that it was just a ring, that they could craft another, that their love didn't hinge on a piece of metal. His frustration masked his deeper fear that Naomi's obsession with the object revealed fractures in their relationship he wasn't ready to face. Their argument escalated, voices bouncing against the hollow walls of the estate, each word sharper than the last. Naomi's fear spilled out. She spoke of her family's history, of marriages collapsing around her like dominoes, one after another. She confessed that the ring wasn't just hers, it carried the weight of legacy, of promises too fragile to endure without physical proof. Her desperation silenced Jacob momentarily, forcing him to see the raw edge of her vulnerability. Then, as if fate had orchestrated the timing, Naomi's phone lit up. June's voice burst through the receiver, carrying the news Naomi had longed for: the ring had been found. Naomi's cry of relief echoed through the estate, a sound of unrestrained joy that melted her anger in an instant. She promised June she would never be careless again, that she would guard the ring with her life. Jacob tried to anchor her back to the present, reminding her that their bond didn't depend on trinkets. Love, he said, was what mattered. To prove his point, he pulled from his pocket a relic of their own, a pair of handcuffs lined with velvet fur, a gift Naomi had once given in the heat of their passion. The gesture was both playful and intimate, a reminder of the spark that had always bound them. The shift in energy was immediate. The tension dissolved, replaced by laughter, by the rekindling of desire that surged between them. They embraced fiercely, the search momentarily forgotten as the grand estate became their sanctuary of intimacy. Their argument, though unresolved in its depth, melted into something primal, a reminder of why they had endured so much together. But somewhere beyond the walls of Hawthorne, June sat alone, the rings heavy in her possession, her mind whirling with questions she dared not voice aloud. The phone call had connected one thread, but countless others dangled loose, waiting to be tied. Leslie's suspicions festered, unseen, and Ted's departure left behind a silence that would not easily be filled. Each of them stood on the edge of revelations they weren't yet ready to face, bound together by fragments of truth and the weight of secrets too sharp to remain buried. The night after Naomi's elation over the recovered ring, unease began to ripple through each of their lives. June, though relieved she could return the band, couldn't shake the shadow of Ted's words. His casual remark about marriage bands belonging to the young stayed with her. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it weighted, tired, a confession disguised as small talk. She replayed his voice in her mind, sensing a loneliness buried beneath his calm exterior, the same loneliness she herself had carried for years. At the diner, she kept the rings close, turning them over again and again in the quiet moments between customers. Each engraving, each scuff told a story. She felt like the keeper of broken vows, as though the universe had chosen her to witness all the love people had thrown away. It unsettled her but also connected her in an unspoken way to Ted, whose eyes had betrayed recognition when he handled them. Leslie, meanwhile, grew restless. The fragments of conversation she had overheard clung to her thoughts like burrs. She couldn't ignore the possibility that Ted was drifting into dangerous territory with June. At first, she tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but jealousy has a way of demanding attention. She replayed their voices, the hushed tones, the pauses that seemed too heavy with meaning. In her mind, she stitched a story of betrayal, one that made her heart ache and her pride burn. When Ted returned home that evening, Leslie studied him. His movements were ordinary, removing his jacket, loosening his tie, but to her they seemed rehearsed, as if he were performing the role of husband rather than living it. She wanted to confront him, to demand the truth, but her fear of pushing him further away silenced her. Instead, she buried her doubts under forced smiles, while inside her suspicions metastasized. Across town, Naomi and Jacob were caught between relief and tension. The ring, now within reach thanks to June, brought Naomi a sense of stability, yet Jacob remained unsettled by her attachment to it. He watched her cradle it in her hand, as though it were a lifeline, and he wondered if he was enough. The memory of their argument lingered like smoke, even though their intimacy afterward had masked it temporarily. Jacob told himself he was secure in her love, but small cracks formed in his confidence. He remembered the way she had spoken of her family's failed marriages, as though she expected history to repeat itself. He feared she didn't fully believe in their bond, that she needed metal proof of what he thought should be undeniable. When Naomi answered June's call again the next day, gratitude poured out of her voice. She promised to meet and collect the ring properly, to thank her in person. Jacob overheard and frowned. To him, June was a stranger, yet Naomi spoke of her with reverence, almost as though June were a guardian watching over their love. That unsettled him. He didn't like outsiders interfering in matters of the heart, and he especially didn't like that Naomi seemed to place so much weight on June's involvement. June, for her part, was torn. Returning the ring was simple enough, but she hesitated. There was more she wanted to say, truths she wanted to probe. She wondered about Naomi and Jacob's bond, about why this single ring carried such gravity. She sensed connections forming, threads binding strangers together through the language of loss and suspicion. The next time Ted stopped by the diner, the air between him and June was taut with unspoken words. She placed his coffee down and lingered a little too long, her fingers brushing the counter nervously. He noticed. Of course, Ted always noticed details, but he said nothing at first. Instead, he tried to act casual, asking about the rings again, whether she had figured out who they belonged to. June admitted she had, her tone quiet but steady. She explained that the engravings matched Naomi and Jacob, and that she had already contacted them. Ted nodded slowly, his jaw tightening in thought. Funny how something so small carries so much weight, he murmured. People hold on to symbols long after they've forgotten the feeling. His words struck June like a confession, and she couldn't hold back anymore. Are you talking about them? She asked softly. Or yourself? Ted's eyes lifted to hers, guarded yet vulnerable. For a moment, Leslie's worst suspicions might have been confirmed, though Leslie wasn't there to see it. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he deflected, saying only that marriage was complicated, more than anyone ever admitted when they slipped a ring onto their finger for the first time. Leslie, however, had grown desperate. Unable to endure her silence, she returned to the diner on her own, watching from a distance. When she saw June and Ted leaning closer than necessary, her fears crystallized. In her mind, the picture was clear. Ted was seeking solace where he shouldn't, and June was all too willing to provide it. Her imagination painted vivid scenarios. Maybe the children June mentioned were his. Maybe their bond was a buried secret finally resurfacing. The not knowing tormented her more than any truth could. She considered storming in, confronting them both, but she restrained herself. Instead, she retreated, choosing to investigate quietly. If Ted had a secret, she would uncover it piece by piece. Meanwhile, Naomi prepared to meet June, her excitement masking the tension with Jacob. She dressed with care, holding the ring's absence in her mind like a phantom limb. Jacob accompanied her, though reluctantly. He didn't trust June's involvement, but he wanted to see for himself. When they arrived, June greeted them warmly, handing the ring back with reverence, as though returning a sacred relic. Naomi's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She slipped the ring onto her finger immediately, sighing with relief. Jacob, however, watched silently, his expression unreadable. June asked questions, gentle ones that carried more weight than they seemed. How had they lost the ring? Why did it matter so much? Naomi spoke openly about her fears, about the legacy of broken marriages and her desperate desire not to follow the same path. Jacob shifted uncomfortably, hearing his own doubts mirrored back at him. Ted appeared moments later, catching sight of the small gathering. He greeted them casually, but the sight of Naomi and Jacob with June unsettled him. He wasn't part of their story, yet somehow he was tied to it through June, through the rings, through everything unsaid. Leslie, watching from outside the diner's window, saw them all together: Ted, June, Naomi, and Jacob, and her suspicions hardened into conviction. This wasn't coincidence. There were connections she hadn't yet understood, secrets that tied them all together in ways they refused to admit. She pressed her hand against the glass, unseen, her heart racing with the certainty that she was on the edge of discovering something life-changing. Inside, June felt the tension thickening. She could sense the distance between Jacob and Naomi, the guardedness in Ted's silence, the weight of Leslie's absence, though she didn't know she was so close. The rings had brought them together, but they were more than tokens now. They were catalysts, unearthing truths none of them were ready to face. Naomi clutched her ring tightly. Jacob glanced at her with doubt. Ted's thoughts wandered to confessions he couldn't speak, and June stood at the center, bearing witness to all of it. The air in the diner seemed charged, as though one wrong word could set everything ablaze. The diner became the silent stage where every secret hovered, waiting to be forced into the light. Naomi's joy at reclaiming her ring lingered, but Jacob's unease shadowed her happiness. June's role as mediator, as the one who unearthed lost promises, gave her an authority none of them expected. Ted's presence only made the air heavier, each glance between him and June feeding Leslie's growing certainty that something unforgivable was unfolding. Days passed, but none of them left those moments behind. Leslie's jealousy festered into obsession. She began to follow Ted, not openly, but with the quiet precision of someone who believed her entire life was about to collapse. Every late night at the diner, every unexplained delay at work, became evidence in her mind. She watched June from afar, memorizing her gestures, her expressions, the way she seemed both lonely and grounded, as if she had built her own strength out of solitude. June herself remained restless. Returning Naomi's ring should have given her closure, yet instead it felt like the opening of a door she couldn't close. The rings she still kept in her drawer weighed on her more heavily now, each one whispering of another story, another broken vow. She wondered whether they were a warning, proof that love was always fragile, that promises turned to dust no matter how fiercely people clung to them. Ted returned to the diner again and again, though he told himself it was habit, nothing more. But when June poured his coffee, when their hands brushed for the briefest second, he felt something stir that he couldn't name. It wasn't love, not yet. It was recognition, the kind one soul offers another when they share the same loneliness. He didn't say it aloud, but June could see it in his eyes. Naomi, with the ring back on her finger, tried to convince herself everything was safe again. Yet the arguments with Jacob didn't stop. If anything, they grew sharper. Jacob resented how much power she gave to the object, how her relief seemed tied more to the band than to him. He asked her one night if she would still stay if she lost it again, and her silence answered for her. That silence cut deeper than any scream. The night everything unraveled began quietly. Leslie finally stepped into the diner, no longer willing to hide in shadows. She carried herself with a brittle confidence, her gaze fixed on Ted as though daring him to lie with his eyes. June froze at the sight of her, sensing the storm before the first words were spoken. Naomi and Jacob, by coincidence or by fate, arrived shortly after, drawn back to the place where their fragile relief had been born. The five of them sat in uneasy orbit, each aware of the others but pretending at civility. Then Leslie broke the silence. Her voice trembled as she accused Ted of betrayal, her words spilling faster than she could contain them. She spoke of overheard whispers, of rings and children, of the way his tone softened only for June. She demanded answers, her pain raw and unfiltered. Ted tried to steady her, to insist that nothing improper had passed between him and June. But his hesitation, his guarded tone, only deepened her suspicion. June, unwilling to let silence twist the truth further, stepped in. She admitted to the conversations, to the late-night exchanges, to the strange intimacy forged not by desire but by recognition. "We were speaking as people who have both been lonely," she said, her voice firm. "Not as lovers." The explanation did little to soothe Leslie. In her eyes, loneliness shared was already intimacy betrayed. Tears burned her cheeks as she demanded to know why Ted had never spoken to her with the tenderness he had shown June. Ted had no answer, and the absence of words was louder than any confession. At that moment, Naomi, overwhelmed by the rawness of it all, clutched her ring like a lifeline. She shouted that love was nothing without proof, that symbols mattered because people failed. Jacob snapped, finally breaking under the weight of her obsession. He tore the ring from her finger and hurled it onto the counter, his voice cracking as he declared that their love was supposed to be more than metal and tradition. The sound of the ring clattering on the diner's surface echoed like a gunshot. Everyone froze, eyes drawn to the small bend spinning in place before settling. It was more than a piece of jewelry, it was the truth laid bare. Naomi collapsed into tears, Jacob's anger melting into despair. Their fight was no longer about the ring, it was about the fragility of love itself. June picked it up gently, her hands trembling. She looked at Naomi and Jacob, then at Ted and Leslie. "These rings," she whispered, "they carry everyone's fear. Not just yours. People think they're promises, but really they're mirrors. They show us what we're afraid to lose, and what we already know we might." The words silenced the diner. For the first time, all of them felt the same truth pressing down: love was both fragile and enduring, both temporary and eternal, depending on how one chose to see it. Leslie, through her tears, realized her suspicion had been less about Ted and more about her own fear of losing him. Naomi and Jacob saw their fight for what it was, not about a ring, but about whether they trusted themselves to love without it. Ted understood the loneliness he had carried wasn't solved by June, but by confronting the distance in his own marriage. And June, holding the ring, finally understood why the abandoned bands had always found their way to her. She was their witness, not their keeper. In the quiet that followed, no one spoke of betrayal again. Instead, they sat together in fragile truce, each of them carrying wounds but also clarity. The night had not healed them, but it had revealed them. The rings no longer felt like anchors. They were reminders, sharp and undeniable, of the choices that remained in their hands. When they left the diner, Leslie holding Ted's arm, Naomi clutching Jacob's hand even as her fingers shook, June alone but at peace, they stepped into a night that felt heavier, but also clearer. The gates between them had opened, not to reconciliation or perfect happiness, but to the truths each of them had tried so long to avoid. And once open, those gates could never be shut again.